Let's talk about quotes. Quotes are a wonderful way to add color to a story, to make a story come alive. Use quotes to let people offer opinions or to describe something in a colorful way. Don't use quotes to convey facts. It's not the most efficient way to convey facts, and it can be jarring to readers and viewers. Likewise, it sometimes makes more sense to paraphrase what people are saying rather than to use an exact quote. Sometimes quotes ramble on and on. Sometimes people will say things using cumbersome language. Sometimes they'll go off point and maybe they'll get back on point. And if you include that entire quote, you're really not doing anybody a service. So you can convey what a person says by paraphrasing rather than quoting exactly when that's the logical thing to do. And then just look for some other circumstance within your story to use an exact quote to do what you want that quote to do, which is to make a person's opinion colorful and to make your story colorful and relatable. It is important for the reader to understand immediately who is speaking in quoted material. So let's say, for example, you've got a fire, and you quote the fire chief or an assistant fire chief, and you identify the person that way. Well, you don't need to explain why the fire chief is being quoted about a fire. That's kind of obvious. But let's say you're quoting somebody who is a neighbor who lives right near where the fire occurred. Well, if you don't identify that person as a neighbor, it isn't clear to the reader or viewer why you are including that person's quote, why that person's quote is relevant to the story. So there's obviously room for judgment here, but don't assume that the reader or viewer knows what you know, and identify a person so that it facilitates a reader's understanding of the story. When you introduce a quote, it shouldn't repeat something you've already provided, right? So you want to give context for a quote, but the quote shouldn't just reiterate that context. Example, you say that neighbors were shocked when they saw the magnitude of the fire, and that's your paraphrasing. And the next sentence begins with a quote, "I was shocked by the magnitude of the fire," said such and such a neighbor. I know that sounds silly, but it happens a lot, especially with new journalists. It happens an awful lot. So you can't change the quote, so either don't use the quote because you haven't really used the quoted material to add anything to the story, or change the way that you've introduced the quote. Change the context that you've written so that the quote now adds to what you have written, and the quote now does what you want it to do, which is to add color to something you've already stated. Another point about quotes, be aware that people speak in such a way that might embarrass them if their exact language was written down for people to read. And this really applies to written text and doesn't really apply to broadcast. You might hear somebody say, "I'm gonna go," as though they are saying G-O-N-N-A. They said going to, but we speak in a somewhat casual way, or somebody orders an iced tea. They ordered an iced tea, I-C-E-D-T. There's no need to embarrass them. There are exceptions to that. There's exceptions to everything, but one exception would be somebody whose colorful way of speaking is relevant to what they are trying to communicate. So imagine somebody who is known to speak in a southern drawl, and that is part of that person's persona. Or a hip-hop artist, for example, that purposely speaks in a way representing the kind of person he is and the kind of music he's performing. That's fine. To disguise things at that point would be disingenuous. So a little caution there, but generally speaking, For the typical person who is not used to being quoted in a newspaper article, there's no need to embarrass them. They said going to, you just heard gonna. Last point on quotes. Can you use foul language? The answer is maybe. It really depends on several factors. I don't know any news organization that has an absolute rule against it, not anymore anyway. And I don't know any news organization that says you could just do it at will. It really depends. Ask yourself this. Is the actual language, the exact curse word, relevant to the story? Or could you not say that a person used a pejorative word or used foul language or paraphrase what he or she said? If the answer is that the exact language itself doesn't add anything to the reader or viewer's understanding, then probably don't use the word. It would be gratuitous at that point. The converse of that is you don't want to purposely exclude foul language when the exact word itself is very, very meaningful. So, if it's two friends arguing and one of them uses a foul language, there's no reason to report that. But what if one of them is a politician, and said in a public place? Then maybe it does. I'll give an example of that. But here's an example where you wouldn't or shouldn't quote a person. Let's say you're in a locker room after the game, and athletes are speaking to one another as they do, and they speak in colloquial language, and that includes curse words. There's no point in reporting that. There's really nothing that is added to the story when you use the language itself. Obviously, I am stereotyping here about what goes on in the locker room, but that's kind of the point. If it fits in with the stereotype, then there's really no news value in using exact language. But if you are a candidate for president and you use a racist word, then I might argue that the word itself must be reported, because to describe the word, saying candidate so-and-so said something racist, doesn't really have the same impact, and somebody running for political office isn't expected to use that exact language. And so by using it, you are actually contributing to the reader or viewer's understanding of that. And by the way, that happened, that's not a hypothetical, it happened in the presidential race in 1984 when a candidate did use a racist word, and I know a lot of news organizations used it. By the way, you will notice that in that anecdote, I did not tell you what that word is, which illustrates my point. I've conveyed the story, and using the actual word itself would not have added anything to my anecdote. It's the same anecdote with the word and without it, therefore I'm not going to use it. If you want to Google it yourself, you can. It's Jesse Jackson was running for president in 1984, running for the Democratic nomination. So Google it if you want. And finally, if you're not sure, this is one of those situations where you can ask an editor or a producer or a news director. These are kinds of decisions that might be best made at a higher level, so have your own thoughts, but don't be afraid to ask.